Dr. Denis Petro, a member of our founding board of directors, drug researcher, and an MS expert, will tell us now the clinical view that Jim just espoused so emotionally. Dr. Petro.
Thank you. I distributed about 200 copies of a handout, which has what actually I will sort of breeze through. If you don't have a copy, they're floating around. Also, if anyone wants to contact me about any of the things I'm going to talk about, you can contact me by a very simple email address, and that is my initials followed by MS followed by MD. So it's DJP MS MD at AOL.com, and that's the address I check fairly frequently about issues related to this problem. First, I have to make a couple of disclaimers. One of the disclaimers is about financial interests in any of the products that I'll discuss, or talking about off-label indications. Well, obviously, use of cannabinoids in multiple sclerosis would be considered an off-label indication. I have no financial relationship with anyone associated with this process, never have accepted any fees with respect to any patients, with respect to any testimony, depositions, affidavits, etc., with regard to the MS story. I'm a clinical neurologist. You can see this is what a neurologist uses, a reflex hammer. I worked at the FDA for a number of years, consulted with the FDA, worked with them on orphan drugs, and also have worked in industry over the last 30 years, worked with companies like Pfizer, Wyeth, SmithKline Beecham, which is now GlaxoSmithKline, and have written probably 20 different NDAs and the equivalent documents for the European community in Brussels and in the UK. First thing we have to understand is that we should look at the history. What's the story? How did we get to where we are today? A very simple way to look at the MS historical record is to just go to PubMed. Everybody has access, or you can go to Google. If you go to PubMed, type in cannabis, multiple sclerosis, you'll now see a total of, I think, 65 publications up to date. Dr. Meshulam has maybe 20. Other people in the room have many. In the 1980s, there were 3 publications. In the 1990, 13. From 2000 to 2004, there have been 49. Probably by the end of the year, there'll be 100. Next week's copy of the journal Neurology has 2 articles about the medical use of cannabis. So we are moving ahead. The first article that was ever published and cited by PubMed was a publication by 2 doctors from Penn State University Medical Center, myself and Dr. Carl Ellenberger. This was a 9-patient study that looked at the drug Delta-9 THC, which is actually this drug right here. It's actually a little gelatin capsule. We studied 9 patients because on the ward I'd find lots of people that would make claims that marijuana was a good thing, good for migraine, good for pain, good for spasticity, good for, in many cases, what ails you. Actually, the most remarkable thing about seeing patients back in that day was one spastic patient who came in the clinic insisting that he, in fact, was better with medical marijuana, and we poo-pooed it. So we did the obvious N of 1 clinical trial. That is, we allowed him to smoke a marijuana cigarette, came back in the room, re-examined him, and essentially his neurologic exam after inhaled cannabis about 15 minutes later was clinically normal. His upgoing toes were now downgoing, which means it's normal. His hyperreflexia was gone. His clonus was gone, et cetera, and essentially that's why we did this clinical trial. In preparation for the trial, I went down to the FDA because they initially rejected my request to do the trial because they said there's no evidence that, in fact, marijuana does anything good for people. And then I talked to the medical doctor at the FDA, and it was clear he had no understanding. He was not a neurologist, but he didn't know what spasticity was. When I told him about it, he thought it was something totally different related to rheumatoid arthritis. So that's sort of where the problem began. Anyway, again, because of time, I'll skip ahead. In 1986, I wrote a protocol and got funding to do a clinical trial of the drug cannabidiol. It was a 40-patient subchronic 1-month study. To make a long story short, I won't get into the details, but I never could get drug. People said, well, that's too much drug. We can't make that amount of drug. And it turns out that the drug was actually made in South America. I called South America, and they said, there's tons of the drug. It's not a real problem. But the problem was actually with the DEA in the United States. The DEA, this is 1966, 86, 87. You remember the politics of the issue back then. We're talking drug war. We're talking issues that are unrelated to health care for sure. In 1987, I testified in front of Dr. Young in terms of the possibility of rescheduling marijuana. After my direct testimony, the judge, who is Judge Young, the late Dr. Young, he commended me and he said that was the best description of what the situation is with regard to medical marijuana of anybody that's presented evidence at the hearing. Needless to say, the government rejected the rescheduling petition. In terms of clinical trials with medical marijuana, I only have 4 minutes, so I'm going to just breeze right through. There were a total of about 7 other studies done. They all confirmed that, in fact, marijuana has effects on spasticity, which are beneficial to patients with not a particularly bad safety profile. There was one study published which all the DEA and other people say, the Greenberg study, they say that showed that it wasn't good for spasticity. Well, that was a study of balance. That wasn't a study of spasticity. But you see, when people with DEA go to the seminars, they're told something. And I had 3 independent people tell me about the Greenberg study. You know they all had gone to the same seminar. But again, it's unrelated to spasticity. But that's often cited as a negative study. Needless to say, over the years, many patients now use marijuana for treatment of spasticity. Can this? Okay. And I'm going to breeze through. Again, for some reason now it's out of order, but I'll mention there were 2 sort of landmark studies that, in fact, in terms of the scientific evidence, sort of tied up the story. That is a study published in Nature in the year 2000 by Baker et al. And in this study, there was an animal model. Sure enough, this is the study that demonstrated that in this animal model, when cannabinoids are given, there's a direct effect on certain receptors in the brain. And in fact, this got a lot of media attention when it was published. The next. Okay, the next study, which again is another landmark study, which was alluded to yesterday, was a study, again from the UK, published in Brain. And this alluded to the fact that not only may cannabis have effects on acute symptoms, but in fact on progression of disease. This is this should be above the fold in the New York Times today. But needless to say, it isn't. It's an incredibly important paper. Okay. I'm going to mention a couple of other clinical trials. There was a 16-patient trial. Again, it got a lot of media attention in the USA that said it was a negative trial of cannabinoids. Well, it was a negative trial because it used a drug that's subtherapeutic. When people develop drugs, and I won't go through why and how people develop drugs, sometimes they want to increase the safety margin. In this study, they never really used an effective dose of cannabinoids. Thankfully, Dr. Russo wrote the letter to the editor that I would have wrote if I had a little more time. But the amazing thing is, in the response to his letter to the editor, they essentially knocked me for my study done 25 years ago, and I thought how ironic that is. In other words, I hit the right dose to get efficacy. They missed it by doing a bad study, and they're criticizing me. Welcome to America. Okay. Another study, a big study, and again, for the sake of time, it's called the CAMS study, C-A-M-S study. Again, guess what? Out of the UK. This demonstrated efficacy, some efficacy, for relatively low-dose cannabinoids in spasticity. And I won't go through the details of the study, but the most important part of the study was never taken up in the American media, and that was the fact that in terms of disease progression, there was evidence in the patients getting active drug that perhaps, guess what, cannabinoids has a disease-modifying effect. Let's cut to the chase. Okay, in the review, again, it's in the handout, so I won't go through the details. This describes certainly some of the comments with regard to that British study. Now, we don't have the GW pharmaceutical results. They're coming, and they're obviously under some secrecy because they're submitted to the British regulators. The author of the study mentions it depends all on the political will of people as far as where this thing is going. Pogo had a nice comment in 1970. That is, we have met the enemy, and he is us. Now, in the United States, I'm a clinical neurologist. As almost a joke at this point, I would go annually to the American Academy of Neurology and propose sessions on cannabis, on clinical uses of marijuana in neurology, and other people in the room recognize that that has always been rejected. Repeatedly, I've sent letters to the 2 MS societies in the United States, and again, I've gotten essentially benign neglect versus contempt. I went to the UK in the year 2001, gave a couple of talks in Bristol and London, England, met with the MS Society there. I asked for more information. By the time I had gotten back to the United States, I had a FedEx parcel which included an incredible amount of information with regard to their position on cannabis, which was pro-cannabis, supporting trials, giving money to research in cannabis, et cetera, et cetera. Regulatory bodies, I don't have the time to go through the horrors there. Okay, we do have unresolved issues about cannabis when it gets to the FDA in the United States. Those are actually the most important document as far as the FDA goes to what's in the label. And I'll again sort of highlight one thing since I only have about a minute of time. And that is recently the FDA provided guidance on what we call now pharmacogenomics. You can go to the FDA website and download the whole position paper about it. But the important thing is there are variabilities in response of drugs due to patient issues and due to drug metabolism issues. And I'll mention the one major drug metabolism issue which will face cannabis. It faced Marinol for sure. If you look at the labeling, one of the important effects of cannabis is it acts at cytochrome P453A4, and most big pharmaceutical companies in the United States will not develop these kind of drugs anymore because of the drug interaction problem. If you look, Google my name, CD4, you'll see 5 or 6 articles where I talk about some other drugs that have important CD4 receptor interactions. Unfortunately, cannabis is on this list, so that will be a problem for GW in the United States. I think I'm about to end. Yeah, the other phase 4 studies that the FDA were probably going to be interested in terms of MS are cognition studies, drug interaction studies, certain other conditions. Obviously, cardiovascular studies and addiction liability assessments. With regard to cognition, 50% of MS patients have some cognitive problem, 10% of MS patients have severe cognitive difficulty. That will be a problem. Finally, I'll end. All our science measured against reality is primitive and childlike, and yet it is the most precious thing we have. So again, at that point, I'll end on time, hopefully. Thank you for your attention. Oh, one other point. For anybody in the United States, I think this is a fabulous document for people to get from the people in Shattuck Avenue in Berkeley at safeaccessnow.org. It's MS and medical marijuana. And it is not filled with baloney and junk. It is very good because it has all the appropriate citations you want to need. Thank you.